Barbarian is a 2022 horror thriller directed by Zach Krager. So the movie starts with a young woman named Tess arriving at her Airbnb in the middle of the night to discover that the key isn't in the lockbox. She decides to ring the doorbell to see if anybody's home, and some random sleepy dude answers the door. After exchanging who the fuck are you, Tess tells him that this is her Airbnb and she booked it a month ago. But he tells her that he booked it on HomeAway a few weeks ago. He invites her inside to get out of the rain until they can get things sorted out, and after a brief hesitation, Tess cautiously agrees to come inside. They double-check their reservations, and it seems that they were both somehow booked to stay there at the same time. He says that she likely won't be able to find a hotel because there's a medical convention in town, so he invites her to spend the night there. She's a bit hesitant on account of the fact that she has a thing about clean sheets and he happens to be a complete fucking stranger, but with no other options, she agrees to stay the night and he agrees to wash the sheets. She goes to wash up, locking every single door along the way, and comes back to find Keith sitting at the kitchen table with a bottle of wine and 2 glasses. So while they wait for the sheets in the wash, they sit down and get to know each other. Tess tells him that she's in town for a job interview for the research department on a documentary. Keith tells her that he's familiar with the director's work and that he's actually the co-founder of one of the groups that her upcoming movie is about. What a coincidence! No, seriously, it's actually just a crazy coincidence apparently. Later, they set up the freshly cleaned sheets on the bed and Keith wishes her a good night before closing the door. And Tess, just all smitten as a kitten, cozies up in bed to go to sleep. But later that night, she hears a weird noise and wakes up to find her bedroom door wide open, and Keith seemingly having a nightmare on the couch. She wakes him up, and he's all like, what the fuck? And she's all like, hey, did you open my door? And he's all like, what? No, I'm just over here having crazy nightmares on the couch, bitch, what the fuck? And she's all like, ah, shit, sorry, my bad. And goes back to the bedroom, this time locking the door behind her. The next morning, when Tess goes outside to her car, she takes a look around and notices that the house that they're staying in seems like it's the only one that's even livable on the entire street. She makes it to her job interview and it goes off without a hitch. On her way back to the Airbnb, Tess starts to notice that the entire area seems to kind of be a total shit show. She arrives back at the house and within seconds of getting out of her car, a crazy homeless guy starts running and yelling at her from down the street. She makes it inside just in time as the crazy guy makes it onto the porch and starts pounding on the door and yelling at her to come out of the house. She calls the police and they basically say you're on your own since they don't have any available units in the area. But it's not a super big deal since the creepy homeless guy has seemingly gone away. After literally having the shit scared out of her, she realizes that there's no toilet paper in the bathroom and goes hunting all over the house for some. She eventually finds a stash in the basement and goes to grab a roll, not realizing that the door is closing behind her and she ends up getting locked in the basement. It's at this point that she remembers that she left her phone upstairs so she can't call Keith to let her out, and she also has the key from the lockbox so even when Keith does show back up, he won't be able to get in the house. Whoops. So shit out of luck, she gets to work trying to find a way out of the basement. She moves a duck statue on a shelf and finds a weird rope sticking out of the wall, so naturally she's like, hey, why don't I pull on that shit and just see what happens? And what do you know, it opens up a hidden door to a pitch-black secret passageway. And she's all like, nope, and goes back to sitting on the basement steps. But this is a horror movie, so naturally her curiosity gets the best of her, and after a while she tries to use the mirror to reflect the light to see if she can get a look down the secret passageway. She sees the light reflecting off a door handle and figures, hey, I've already checked out one hidden room today, why not try my luck on another? She opens the door to find what looks like a torture chamber with nothing in it but an old camcorder, a blood-soaked mattress, and a crusty bucket, with the only decoration being a bloody handprint on the wall. Apparently not satisfied with her cozy new living arrangement, she hightails it out of there just in time to have the crap scared out of her by Keith knocking on the door outside. She bangs on the basement window to get his attention and tells him that she's locked in the basement and passes him the keys so he can let himself in the house and let her out. She tells him about the basement bucket dungeon, so Keith heads downstairs to check it out. She asks him if he can see it, he says yeah, and she's all like, cool, well then can you get back up here now so we can get the out of here? And Keith doesn't answer. She calls for him again and still gets no answer, which is always a good sign from a guy that just seconds ago went to check out a newly discovered torture chamber in the basement of your Airbnb. Tess heads back to the dungeon to find no Keith, and decides to check under the bed for some reason. Like for some reason after discovering a hidden torture chamber in the basement of his Airbnb, he would be like, oh my god, a perfect opportunity to play hide and seek. Anyway, Keith isn't playing hide and seek under the bed and has seemingly disappeared into thin air. After taking a look around, she discovers yet another hidden door and figures, well, I'm already 2 for 2 on opening creepy hidden doors today, so why not just swing this one open and see what's on the other side? She opens it up to find a cave with some stairs. She calls down for Keith and hears Keith faintly screaming for help way off in the distance. She thinks about going back, but then figures, sure, I'm just a girl with nothing but a cell phone. F it, I'm going in. She makes it to the bottom of the stairs and heads a bit further and comes across a room filled with rusty animal cages. Or at least I hope that's rust. Now in full freakout mode, she starts frantically calling for Keith. She heads a bit further, and all of a sudden Keith comes crawling out of the darkness on his hands and knees. He tells her that there's somebody else down there and that something bit him. Tess says they have to go back and get out of there, but he says that's where the thing that bit him was, so they can't go that way. And right then, some crazy screeching monster person thing comes running out of the darkness and grabs Keith by the neck and starts smashing his head against the cave wall. We then jump to a bright sunny California day where an actor named AJ is having a grand old time enjoying some solo carpool karaoke when he gets a phone call from his agent and a producer of the TV show that he's working on. They inform him that he's being fired because one of his co-stars has made a rape accusation against him, and he goes from being very happy to very not happy very quickly. He goes and consults with his accountant to find out how much money he'll have left after his legal expenses, and his accountant casually informs him that he'll be broke within the next 3 months. So he hops on a plane and flies to Michigan to start liquidating some of his assets to cover the cost of his impending legal fees. And you guessed it, one of those assets happens to be the house that Tess and whatever's left of Keith are currently staying at. But apparently AJ had no idea that anybody was currently staying there, because when he takes a look around and sees Tess's stuff, he calls up his property manager and asks her who's in his house, but she says they haven't rented it out in months. But he gets over that real quick and makes himself at home. He then gets a call from a buddy and says that he's back in town and wants to meet up for drinks. While at the bar, his nameless buddy asks him what did actually happen with the co-star making the rape accusation against him. AJ tells him nothing happened, they just hooked up and she wasn't that into it and said no at first, but just took some convincing and it's cool because, well, he basically just admits to raping her. He wakes up the next morning and airmails last night's nachos directly into the toilet bowl, and while hanging out on the bathroom floor, he notices Keith's toothbrush and remembers, oh yeah, there's people living in my house, I should probably look into that. He goes to take a peek in the basement, but the basement light is burned out from being left on for days, so he calls down to see if anybody's there. Nobody responds, but he hears a noise and gets spooked, so he suits up in his toughest pink shirt and arms himself with a steak knife, grabs what looks like a Fisher-Price flashlight instead of just using the light on his phone for some reason, and heads downstairs. He finds the mirror left propped up by Tess and hears a noise coming from behind the wall and then notices the rope. So naturally, like everybody else in this universe, his first instinct is to just start tugging on that shit, and he discovers the hidden passageway. And also, just like everyone else, he decides to take a look inside. He discovers the torture chamber and immediately gets to Googling to see if torture chambers count towards the square footage of the overall living space. While taking some measurements of his newly discovered dungeon, he bumps into the other hidden door and calls out a quick yo-yo, doesn't hear anything, and without missing a beat, continues measuring. After measuring his way down the stairs and around the animal cages, he sees a light further down the cave and discovers yet another room. This one with a bunch of blankets on the floor and a baby care instructional video playing on a TV explaining how to properly breastfeed. While standing there all weirded out, he suddenly notices something pulling on the other end of the measuring tape until it gets pulled all the way out and gets ripped right out of his hand. Now, finally freaked out, he pulls out his trusty steak knife and puts it to good use by immediately turning and running away. While on his little midday cave jog, he drops his Fisher-Price flashlight, rendering it pretty much useless, and through its flickering, the head-smashing cave lady monster thing comes strolling out of the darkness to say hi. He then continues running away and runs straight into a giant pit and apparently lands on his trusty steak knife and stabs himself right in the arm. Once locked in the pit, he finally meets Tess, who immediately tells him to shut the f*** up. We then cut to a flashback of the 1970s when the house and the whole neighborhood wasn't all run down and was actually a pretty nice place. We follow Frank, the former owner of the house, as he seemingly does some baby shopping. A worker at the store takes it upon herself to start loading up his cart with a bunch of baby essentials, including the baby care VHS we saw playing on the TV down in the cave. While Frank's loading his groceries into his car, he spots a woman across the street and follows her back to her home. When she goes inside, he pulls out a repairman's uniform from his trunk and puts it on and knocks on the lady's door. He tells her that he's from the water department and pretends to check her plumbing, but instead he just unlocks the bathroom window. He comes out and tells her that everything seems fine and then leaves. When he arrives back at his house while unloading his groceries, his neighbor informs him that he'll be moving out of town and says that the neighborhood's going to hell. He asks Frank if he's planning on staying, and Frank says he's not going anywhere. And as Frank goes inside and heads to the basement, he opens the door and we hear a woman's terrified screams. We then jump back to present day down in the pit where, while tending to AJ's self-inflicted stab wound, Tess tells him that no matter what happens, he has to stay calm because if he gets upset, then she gets upset. She, apparently being the evil head-smashing cave lady monster thing that's been chasing them around down there. Just then, the cave lady shows up and lowers the world's most disgusting baby bottle into the pit and offers it to AJ. Tess tells him to drink it, and AJ's just like, yeah, f*** that. She then points the bottle at Tess, who doesn't hesitate and starts suckling away on it. She then points it back at AJ, and Tess tells him to just drink it, explaining that all she wants is for them to be her babies. The cave lady, seemingly unhappy with AJ's bottle refusal, opens up the pit and hops down there with them. First going over to Tess and lovingly caressing her while saying the word baby. AJ then lets out a whimper, which causes the cave lady to grab him by the neck and give him her version of a stern talking to. AJ screams, which startles the cave lady, who then grabs him by the legs and drags him out of the pit, leaving Tess all alone. She drags AJ into the room with the TV and proceeds to copy what the woman on the tape is doing with her baby and proceeds to give AJ a little boob on the nose. Realizing the pit door has been left open and the cave lady is distracted with AJ, Tess equips herself with AJ's steak knife flashlight combo pack and takes the opportunity to climb out of the pit. Meanwhile, the cave lady figures since AJ didn't want the bottle, he must prefer his milk au naturel, and she gets to work trying to breastfeed him. While trying to sneak out, Tess strips over AJ's measuring tape, which gets the cave lady's attention, and she goes chasing after Tess, who makes it back to the basement only to realize that the basement door is locked. So she smashes the basement window and tries to crawl out and is pulled to safety just in time before the cave lady can grab her. And who pulls her to safety? Why, it's the same creepy homeless guy from before! So apparently, when he was chasing her down the street and yelling at her to come out of the house, it was for her own good. Really feels like he probably could have done a better job articulating that earlier, but whatever. Tess asks him for help and says that they have to go back to get AJ, but he tells her that she should count herself lucky that she even made it out of there alive and that the cave lady isn't even the worst thing down there. He tells her that he lives by the water tower and she'll be safe there, but Tess doesn't want to leave AJ behind. So he warns her that she better not be around there after dark because the cave lady only comes out of the house at night. Trying to find his way out while the cave lady is distracted, AJ comes across a bell on the wall attached to a rope and decides to follow the rope to see where it leads. He follows the rope to a door. Just then, he hears the cave lady snarl off in the distance behind him. He turns around and she slowly appears out of the darkness, but then backs away, seemingly afraid to get any closer to the door. That seems like a pretty bad sign to me, but AJ is hell-bent on avoiding another breastfeeding session, so he opens the door and goes inside. Inside, AJ finds a room with a TV and a radio playing country music with a bunch of trash all over the floor. While taking a look around, he finds what looks an awful lot like the dress that the woman that let Frank in her house all those years ago happened to be wearing. Just then, he hears somebody coughing behind him and he turns around to find an old sick Frank laying in a bed. He tells Frank not to worry because he's going to get out and tell everybody what's going on down there and that the house will be swarming with cops real soon. Frank, seemingly unable to speak, doesn't seem all too happy about this information and starts pointing to something on the bedside table. But AJ doesn't know what he wants, so he just brings the whole table over to him so he can grab whatever he wants for himself. AJ then starts looking around for his phone. Meanwhile, outside, Tess has brought the police to the house and tries to get them to break in and save AJ. But the cop thinks she's just a crazy crackhead and tells her that he doesn't believe her story and the only crime that he sees is that she broke the basement window, and that she's lucky they don't arrest her and take her downtown to sleep off whatever she's on in jail. They then get a call on the radio and leave a devastated Tess standing in the middle of the road. Back down in the cave room with Frank, AJ finds his phone but notices a bunch of tapes with women's names written on them on a shelf. He sees a tape labeled Gas Station Redhead already in the VCR, so he pushes it in. We then hear what sounds like a woman being tortured, and AJ, horrified by what he saw on the tape, shuts it off and asks Frank what the hell is wrong with him. But Frank's a bit preoccupied, rummaging through the bedside table. So AJ yells at him again, and just then we find out what old Frankie boy was looking for in that table. He briefly points the gun at AJ before turning it on himself. Back outside, Tess has apparently had enough of just standing in the middle of the road and throws a rock through the living room window and goes inside and gets her keys off the kitchen table. She gets in her car, and right as she's turning around to leave, the cave lady comes bursting through the front door. So Tess decides to run her over and crashes into the front of the house, pinning her between the car and the house, seemingly solving her crazy cave lady problems once and for all. So she then heads back inside to get AJ. Back down in the cave, AJ takes Frank's gun, since it doesn't seem like he'll be needing it anymore, and he leaves the room to try and find his way out. On her way back down into the cave, the Fisher-Price flashlight finally craps out on Tess, leaving her to navigate her way through the caves in total darkness. She finds her way back to the room with the TV and blankets, and just then she sees a light off in the distance. She calls out to see who's there, but before she can even get a word out, she gets shot. AJ comes running out of the darkness, all apologetic, and picks her up, and together they make it back outside. But when they get there, Tess realizes that the cave lady isn't pinned on the hood of the car where she left her. Tess tells AJ she knows where to go and heads towards the water tower. When they make it over there, the creepy homeless dude reemerges and brings them into his little hideout. Once inside, he tells them that the cave lady isn't a monster, she's just a crazy lady that's been living in that house for 40 years. The guy explains that after the neighborhood went to hell, Frank never left and he's been living down in those tunnels this entire time, and that Frank used to kidnap women and torture them down there, and eventually he started having kids with them, and then having kids with the kids, and says that you can only make so many copies of a copy before you end up with something like the crazy cave lady. Tess asks him how he knows that she can't get into his little hideout, and he proudly says that he's been living there for 15 years and she's never made it in there. And right at that exact moment, she comes bursting through the wall behind him like the f***ing Terminator and picks the dude up and rips his arm off and beats him to death with it. AJ and Tess make a run for it out the back, but can't get over the fence, so they try climbing up the water tower. Once they make it to the top, Tess reminds AJ that he's got a gun, and AJ immediately fumbles with it and drops it over the side. AJ starts panicking and says that he can get away, but Tess is gonna have to slow her down. So he grabs Tess by the hair and throws her off the water tower, telling the crazy cave lady to go get her baby. And as Tess is falling, the cave lady does a nosedive off the water tower to try and save her. AJ takes a peek over the edge to check out his handiwork and sees the cave lady lying on the ground in a pool of blood with a cracked noggin and Tess laying on top of her. He goes down for a closer look and realizes that Tess is still alive. So he immediately starts tripping over himself, making excuses about how he had no choice but to throw her off, or the cave lady was going to kill them both, and he didn't even really throw her off, she just kinda slipped, and he was actually saving her. Jesus, can you believe this fucking guy? But somehow, after all that, the cave lady is still alive. Holy crap, I didn't know inbreeding gave you superpowers. Anyway, she picks up AJ and gouges out his eyes before ripping his head in half, and then goes over and tries to help Tess. She tries to help her up and points back towards the house, but Tess says that she can't go back there. Tess picks up the gun and points it at her head, and the cave lady gives her a little smooch and calls her baby. So seemingly this literal monster cares more about Tess than any of the men in her life. So naturally, her first instinct is to shoot her in the face. And then she gets up and hobbles off into the sunrise to live happily ever after.